Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. One crime would forever change the United States. It wasn't the first of its kind, but the name of the high school where it occurred would be forever synonymous with tragedy. The crime went down on April the 20th of 1999 at Columbine High School, near to the suburban town of Littleton, just outside of Denver, Colorado. School shootings and mass shootings in general have become normalized in today's society. It seems like every week one is happening, as another gunman brutally takes the lives of others, only to be replaced the following week by another shooter, eager to cause more destruction. The stereotype of the school shooter is often correct. Sad to say, but it is true. Unfortunately, the school shooter idea has become a meme, and many notice odd behaviours and comments by these disturbed young men prior to a shooting, but by then it's often too late. Often the shooter is an isolated and alienated young man who has a deep resentment towards society and wants to cause significant harm. The shooters at Columbine High School were not typical loners or outcasts. They were actually relatively normal and seemed to contrast the typical, more modern teenage shooter. In fact, the Columbine tragedy differs entirely to the more modern school shooting, and despite it being the most well-known school shooting, the crazy part is that it was never intended to be a school shooting. Rather, a domestic terrorism plot. The shooters actually wanted to blow up the school with homemade bombs and shoot any survivors. Today, I shall cover the tragedy that shocked North America and spawned an epidemic of young men carrying out merciless attacks on both schools and public areas alike. I hope you enjoy. To really understand the Columbine High School shooting, you have to know about the shooters, 18-year-old Eric Harris and 17-year-old Dylan Klebold. The myth that these two were loners and outcasts comes from the media. In reality, Eric and Dylan were your typical 1990s American teenagers. They had social lives, a tight-knit friendship group, and plenty of potential. Eric was 5'9" and often smoked, drank, and was invited to parties. He was a charmer, winning over girls at school and at the local mall. Dylan, on the other hand, was far less confident than Eric, despite being 6'3", but still, he was by no means an outcast or a loner. Dylan was more of a follower, often seeking validation from Eric, especially in their shared passion for video creating. Dylan had the typical teen self-image worries, being insecure about his shyness and big nose. He was nicknamed Vodka, I'm sure you can guess why, and Dylan was very proud of this nickname. However, it appears like he drank to mostly cope with negative feelings and his typical teenage insecurities. In school, both boys were high achievers. They were intelligent and were part of school clubs. Dylan was part of a school theatre club, working backstage on the sound for productions, and both him and Eric made it to the school football games, alongside playing their parts helping out with video production for the Rebel News network at Columbine High School. It would turn out that Dylan had actually helped Rachel Scott, one of the victims, when her tape became stuck during her talent show performance, just days prior to the massacre. Both Eric and Dylan managed to find dates for school prom, and both had been unassuming, well liked by classmates and teachers alike. Dylan's date had actually secured them 3 of the 4 guns under the guise of a hunting trip. The girl trusted Dylan, as he backed up Eric's false reason for needing them. Nobody could have expected anything out of the ordinary, as the boys were soon to graduate and move on with their lives. Dylan scheduled to attend Arizona University, and Eric wasn't bothered about his future. He knew what was soon to come. Through working at Blackjack's Pizza, which was just down the road from Eric's house, they had funded their mission. Eric was on a rate of $7.65 an hour, and Dylan was on a rate of $6.50 an hour. Eric was utterly reliable, the manager even being guaranteed to turn toward him when control was needed or someone with a talk game was needed to help out. Dylan, on the other hand, was very unreliable. He had applied for a computer job as he wanted to leave Blackjack's Pizza, but he never showed for the interview. The money had gone toward funding their bomb-making plans, weapon and ammunition acquiring, and napalm experiments. They'd been planning the bombing for a while and had planned out every aspect of the massacre, from creating a police diversion at the start to planting duffel bags filled with bombs in the school cafeteria, known as the Commons. Upon detonation at 11:17, the library would collapse on top of the Commons and students would scream and perish in a pit of fire and destruction. The Commons would be fire-ridden and students would dash for the exits, whereby Eric and Dylan would be waiting, strategically placed to shoot at them. Despite there being 25 exits across the whole school, Eric and Dylan knew that at its busiest, the common seated roughly 600 people. Eric and Dylan had nearly 700 rounds for 4 guns and wanted to put them to use, even if some students managed to successfully escape. The police and news crews would arrive soon after, and both Eric and Dylan expected to die in a blaze of glory shootout with police. Their cars would then explode in the school parking lot, and as media filmed the event, everyone would be wiped out. If this plan doesn't provide an insight into the minds of these two men, then I don't know what will. In the years before Columbine, there had been just 10 school shootings. Suburban communities were aware of the school shooter moral panic, following an Alaskan school shooting whereby a student shot the principal and a classmate. But the American intervention in the Kosovo crisis had diverted attention away from school shootings in the days prior to Columbine. The public fear of a school shooting epidemic had seemed to have been dying down. Many didn't anticipate it to be a major future problem. Many school shooters don't plan a massacre this elaborate, or even go to the extent that Eric and Dylan did. In his journal, Eric claimed that he was going to beat the kill count of Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. Along with the main propane-style bombs, each of them would have pipe bombs on hand, referred to as crickets by Eric. They were later observed being thrown by the pair during their spree. The day of the massacre, and Eric and Dylan awoke early, same as usual. Dylan had wrote a note saying make today count in Eric's day planner, and so they were both prepared for what was to come. The pair spent the morning building some of the bombs and then hung out together until 11 AM. Prior to leaving Eric's house, Eric left a cassette tape with his final thoughts, alongside infamous tapes known as the basement tapes, with a final goodbye message. Both then journeyed separately to the diversion point that would kick off their massacre. It was a local park, and they planted the decoy bomb set for 11:14. This was just 3 miles from Columbine High. Driving into the school parking lot, Eric beeped and waved at some girls, and they giggled and waved back. It was 11:10, and Eric hopped out of his car, where he saw Brooks Brown. Brooks was a friend of Eric's, but had seen his darker side, which I'll get into later on. Looking back, Brooks was very thankful that Eric didn't shoot him. He asked Eric why he didn't show up for a psychology test, and Eric replied that it doesn't matter anymore, before telling Brooks that he liked him now and to go home. Brooks obliged, a bit confused, but he did so anyway. Eric and Dylan met up and were confident that the decoy bomb had led police to the park 3 miles away. The police would soon interrupt their plans, and so Eric took control. They needed to progress to the next stage. What Eric and Dylan were not aware of was the fact that the bomb in the park had fizzled. One had detonated and made a loud noise before it caught a patch of grass alight. Reality is completely different to their fantasy, and the pair's terrorist-inspired carnage fantasy would be replaced by a different kind of terror, a more up-close and personal shooting spree. Eric and Dylan moved duffel bags containing bombs into the commons and moved to their parking lot stakeout points. The explosions, screams of students, and carnage was about to begin. It was 11:18, and nothing happened. Where were the explosions, the screams, the carnage? Eric quickly came to the realisation that the bombs hadn't worked. Something had gone wrong, which he must have been perplexed by, as he was super confident in everything going his way. Dylan, being the follower, was more than likely much more nervous by this revelation, and may have wanted to back out of the plan. But Eric, being the control freak, was all in. Something evil was going to happen, regardless of if he had to alter the plan. When the shooting started, many students believed that a senior prank was occurring. It wasn't until students began dropping to the floor that people really took notice. One of these being Dave Sanders. The true hero of this story is this man. He actively saved many children's lives that day, and he was seen running toward the shooters and escorting kids to safety. Unfortunately, he was shot and died in the massacre, paramedics being unable to reach him in time. Eric would begin firing at an officer who had been radioed about reported gunfire. As soon as he pulled into the school parking lot, shots were fired in his direction. Eric missed every one, and the officer returned fire, believing that he'd hit the shooter, who span around. However, Eric then returned fire in the parking lot. Dylan had by this point fled into the school, and Eric quickly caught up with him. Everything happened very quickly, and by 11:24 the pair had made it to the school library. Kids were told to hide under the tables as fear and the reality of the situation hit the startled young people. Throughout the shooting, Eric and Dylan were seen laughing and making comments to people that they'd shot. They had little remorse, if any, sparing only certain people with whom they'd known. The library would be the most depraved portion of the shooting spree. As students were murdered as they hid under tables, they were hurled with insults before being brutally murdered, and many who survived were left broken and, not surprisingly, completely traumatised by what they were forced to witness. The media and SWAT teams had shown up to Columbine High School by now. The story was being aired live across the United States, and the previous fears of an armed shooter in an all-American school resurfaced. What was happening? And where were the shooters? Nobody really knew. As students ran from the school, bloody and terrified, news crews attempted to gain some answers. The media began interviewing kids who had been in the school, literally as many had just managed to get out. Capitalising on the opportunity, they asked if the shooters were outcasts, and they hadn't even gotten their names yet. Students gave their answers, many not even knowing the shooters, and a trench coat theme surfaced. This group, made up of kids who wore trench coats, was named the Trenchcoat Mafia and was described by CNN as a street gang made up of goths and outcasts. In reality, it was just another school subculture like jocks, kids wanting to stand out from their peers. Eric and Dylan had friends in the group, but were not a part of it. The myth that spread was that the Trenchcoat Mafia was involved in the shooting, and this was believed at the time. The police were annoyed by their presence, but the filming continued. The reason for this was because they believed it to be a hostage situation, and the shooter or shooters may be watching the news coverage from inside the school. Upon their arrival to the library hours later, it would turn out that both Eric and Dylan were already deceased. It was never a hostage situation. Police had entered the school at 12:06, but as mentioned, they didn't reach the library where the worst atrocity had occurred until 3:15. What they found shocked them. Children's bodies lay under tables, with blood all over the place. The fire alarm was sounding, and it was deafening. This had left many students and teachers confined to their hiding spots, as they feared that the shooters may still be out there. Police found the two shooters, each with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Guns lay by their side. These were the shooters, and the massacre was over. It had lasted for 49 minutes. The shooters had actually been identified hours before, around 1 PM. Friends and family of them had reported their suspicions to police, and the Harris and Klebold residences had been searched at this time. A bit of background checking was done on the boys, and it turned out that they'd both been caught for a van break-in the previous year. For punishment, they were made to do a year-long juvenile diversion program and complete community service hours. By the end of the program, which they had completed just 10 weeks before the massacre, they seemed to have been on a more positive track, repenting for their bad decision making and crime openly. Eric had another incident which was never truly taken seriously, but is worth mentioning. It involved Brooks Brown. Eric had posted on his website that he was going to kill Brooks, and this was brought to the attention of the police. Not much was done, but Brooks and Eric had managed to put their differences aside and make up. This likely saved Brooks' life. In total, 13 students died at Columbine High School on that day, with many other students still facing long life trauma and injuries from the actions. Like with many other mass shootings, many lives were deeply affected by the actions of the shooters. These include both families of the victims and the community at large. The name Columbine is forever stuck with the label of being a place where this awful tragedy took place. The shooters' families also have to live with the grief that their sons bestowed upon the community. Dylan's family were told that since their son was now dead, hate would be turned toward them instead. This did happen, along with public hate and condemnation being shifted onto perceived causes of these types of events, like Marilyn Manson or the Trenchcoat Mafia. It sounded ludicrous. The people who were to blame were the shooters, not any teen school group or celebrity. Since Columbine, there have been countless school shootings across the United States. The same stereotypical shooter appears in each one, and each one always appears to have been preventable, with warning signs in clear view. Each attack is brazen, and lives are shattered as a result. Will this type of attack ever stop? Or is this just going to continue forever? What are your thoughts? Rest in peace to all of the Columbine victims and victims of other school attacks. It is sad that this is what society has come to. This has been the video on the Columbine High School shooting. As always, thank you for watching.